My name is Marci Shore. I'm a history professor. I work mostly on Eastern Europe, the intellectual history of Eastern Europe, and I am, among other things, a historian of 20th century totalitarianism and the experiences of Nazism and Stalinism in Eastern Europe. I teach at the Munk School at the University of Toronto, beginning now in July of 2025. Um, How I understand now what is happening in my own country is profoundly inflected from what I have understood about the experiences of totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. And with the caveat that no two historical situations are ever exactly the same, there are nevertheless certain patterns that we can recognize. We can recognize how cults of the leader function. We can recognize, you know, a search for scapegoats, a division of society into us versus them, an attempt to redirect all grievance and resentment, and anger at humiliation or inequality or suffering onto some group that can then be scapegoated. We can recognize insecurities about masculinity, attempts to mythologize the past. All fascist movements like to tell their own nation that everybody in their nation was beautiful and innocent since time eternal. But the fact is that there is no such thing, as a nation that has been innocent since time eternal. And the failure to ground ourselves in truth and look at the past with eyes wide open is a constant source of pathology. We see this today in Putin's Russia, and we see this in Trump's United States. We see this in the project that Ron DeSantis was trying to enact in Florida. What can be said in schools about the experience of slavery? Well, teachers are now allowed to tell their students that, well, after all, slaves sometimes learned skills that were beneficial in other realms of their life. There is no chance to move forward as a society without looking at that truth with eyes wide open. We look at how regimes try to bring people in line. We don't have such good language for this in English, but there's very rich language in German and Russian, for instance. In German, we can use the term Gleichschaltung, the bringing everybody into line. In Russian, there's a word called произвол, which is arbitrariness that is always already tinged with tyranny, with terror. And it's a way in which terror and denunciations and violence work, in which nobody knows who will be next. And that paralyzes people and that atomizes them. And so people put their heads down and be quiet and get in line. They try to avoid other people whose signs of vulnerability could potentially be contagious. This leads to classic collective action problems because any individual thinking rationally has a good reason to say that the personal cost and risk of any refusal to compromise with power that I might make would be greater than the social benefits, of my particular act of resistance. But what makes sense rationally at the level of the individual is what taken collectively is what makes tyranny possible. Tyranny feeds off this kind of atomization. The only antidote, we know for that is solidarity, which is very, very hard to affect, and when it comes together, it's a kind of a miracle. But it sometimes does come together. And the advice I would then have, not that I'm really one who has a right to give anybody else advice, is that we have to speak up on behalf of those of us who are more vulnerable than ourselves. We have to speak up on behalf of those who are going to be the first to be taken. Um, and I'll just conclude with one of the more cheerful quotes from Hannah Arendt, who is one of my first philosophical loves and most long-lasting philosophical loves, and somebody whose work I go back to again and again and again. And she wrote, she said, under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some will not. Humanly speaking, she said, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation.